The ballroom at the Harrington Club smelled like old money and fresh roses, and my mother had just asked me to move 3 seats down so my brother could sit next to the photographer from the Tribune. It was my father's retirement dinner. I had flown in from Austin. My mother hadn't mentioned that when she called to tell me about it. What she'd said was, "Please wear something appropriate this time, sweetheart. Not one of your tech conference blazers." I moved 3 seats down. I sat next to my aunt and unfolded my napkin across my lap, and I looked at my phone, and I read the message that had been waiting for me since I landed. Wire confirmed. Acquisition complete. $41 million. I just purchased the building my father's company leased its headquarters from. The actual physical building, 11 floors of glass and steel on Wacker Drive, the address my brother had printed on his business cards for the last 4 years. I set my phone face down on the table. The soup arrived. I picked up my spoon. My name is Claire. I'm 32 years old. And before I tell you what happened when my family finally figured out what I'd been doing for the past 6 years, I want to ask you something. Have you ever sat in a room full of people who share your last name and felt completely, utterly alone? Drop that in the comments. I read every single one. I wasn't always invisible. There was a version of my childhood where I mattered to them. I was maybe 8 or 9, and my father used to bring me into his home office on Saturday mornings and show me spreadsheets, real ones, actual P&Ls from his manufacturing business, Harmon Industrial. He'd point at the columns and say, "See that number right there? That's why we ate steak this week." I thought that was the most interesting thing I'd ever heard. Numbers that meant something. Numbers that told a story. Then my brother was born. I know that sounds dramatic, and I'm not blaming him, not really. He was a baby. He didn't choose any of it. But my brother came into the world, and my father looked at him the way people look at something they've been waiting for their whole life without realizing it. My brother was named after my father. They shared a name, a jaw, and apparently an entire future that had been quietly reassigned before I knew there was anything to lose. By the time I was 13, I wasn't going into the office on Saturday mornings anymore. My brother was. He was 7, and my father was already showing him the spreadsheets I used to study. I started doing my own spreadsheets, in my room, for fun. I know how that sounds, but I didn't have a lot of other options. My parents sent my brother to Exeter for high school, $62,000 a year. They talked about it at dinner like it was the most obvious decision in the world. He needs the network, my father said. The right connections at 17 changed the trajectory of your entire career. That same year, I asked if I could attend a summer program at Northwestern, computational finance. 6 weeks, it cost $4,000, my mother said. "Claire, you're already going to a perfectly good school. Let's not get greedy." I got a part-time job at a coffee shop and paid for it myself. I didn't tell them I went. I said I was staying with a friend. That summer changed everything. Not because of what I learned, though I learned a lot. It changed everything because I met a woman named Dr. Anita Voss, who told me in the 3rd week that I had an unusual mind for pattern recognition and that I should be doing something with it beyond surviving my current circumstances. She said that so plainly, so factually, that I almost didn't understand it was a compliment. I asked her what she meant. She said, "I mean, you're very smart, and someone in your life has made you feel like you're not." I went back to my dorm room and cried for about an hour. Then I opened my laptop and started building. I want to be honest about the next part because people always want the success story to be clean, and it wasn't clean. It was 6 years of working until 2 in the morning and waking up at 6. It was skipping my cousin's wedding because I had a product launch. It was eating pasta with butter for 3 weeks straight because I put everything I had into a server upgrade. It was being embarrassed when my college friends went to nice restaurants and I ordered water and a side salad and said I wasn't that hungry. It was loneliness and doubt, and the specific kind of quiet that settles over you when you're building something no one around you can see yet. What I was building was a risk analytics platform. Specifically, I built software that helped mid-sized commercial real estate firms assess acquisition risk in ways that the big generic platforms couldn't. It sounds dry. It wasn't dry. It was the thing I had always been good at. Reading the numbers underneath the numbers, finding the pattern that didn't show up until you looked at the data sideways. I called it Meridian. By the time I was 28, Meridian had 12 enterprise clients, By 29, we had 40. At 30, a private equity group in Boston made me an offer I declined, then came back with a better one, which I also declined, and then a third offer that I accepted, and which I cannot discuss in detail because of an NDA, but which allowed me to do several things I had been planning for a long time. The first thing I did was establish a holding company. I named it after nothing. Just a sequence of letters that meant nothing to anyone but me. It sat quietly in the background of a lot of transactions over the next 2 years, and nobody connected it to the woman who fixed computers, which is what my family thought I did for a living. I had told them I worked in IT. My mother once introduced me to one of her friends as, "My daughter, she does something with computers." I did not correct her. The second thing I did was start buying debt. Harman Industrial had not been doing well. My father was a proud man and a competent man in his time, but manufacturing in the Midwest had gotten complicated, and he had made a series of decisions over the past decade that made sense in the short term and were quietly catastrophic in the long term. He had refinanced the company's primary loan 3 times. He had taken on a secondary line of credit to fund my brother's expansion into a new product line that underperformed badly. He had borrowed against the building lease. The lender he borrowed from sold that debt, as lender he borrowed from sold that debt, as lenders sometimes do. And the entity that acquired it was quiet and professional and sent very standard correspondence and had a name that meant nothing to anyone. That was me. I didn't do it to hurt him. I want to be clear about that, and I want to be clear about it not in the way people are clear about things when they actually did want to hurt someone and are performing remorse. I genuinely did not set out to destroy my family. What I set out to do was make sure that when everything finally came to a head, which it was going to, regardless of whether I was involved, I had a seat at the table. A real one. Not the seat 3 spots down from the photographer. So, the retirement dinner. My father stood up and gave a speech about legacy. He used that word 5 times. He talked about building something that outlasts you, something that carries your name forward, something your children can steward into the next generation. He looked at my brother when he said children. He looked at my brother when he said steward. He looked at my brother when he said name. He did not look at me. My brother stood up and said a few words. He talked about how much he had learned from my father. He talked about how much he had learned from my father. He talked about how humbling it was to step into those shoes. He talked about his vision for the next phase of Harman Industrial. He had slides prepared. He clicked through them at the dinner table on a laptop while the waitstaff stood awkwardly with dessert. My aunt leaned over to me quietly and said, "He's been rehearsing that for 2 weeks." I said, "I know." She looked at me for a second. My aunt has always been the only one in my family who actually looked at me. She said, "You doing okay, honey?" I said, "I'm doing really well, actually." She didn't ask what I meant. She just patted my hand and turned back to the slides. When dinner was over, my mother pulled me aside near the coat check. She smelled like her usual perfume and a glass and a half of Chardonnay. She said, "I hope you'll make more of an effort to be present for your brother during this transition. He's going to need the family rallied around him." I said, "Of course." She said, "And if you could refrain from mentioning whatever it is you're doing in Austin, he doesn't need the distraction right now." I smiled at her. I said, "I understand completely." I flew back to Austin the next morning. 2 weeks later, I sent an email. It was a standard notice. The kind my company sent routinely, the kind that goes out when a debt obligation reaches a threshold that triggers a review. It went to my father's CFO, not to my father directly. The CFO called my father. My father called his lawyer. His lawyer spent about 4 hours trying to figure out who actually held the debt before someone finally traced it to the holding company, and then it took another day before anyone connected the holding company to me. My phone rang at 6:15 in the morning. It was my father. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. I let that go to voicemail too. The third time I answered, he said, "What have you done?" It wasn't a question. He said it the way people say something when they already know the answer and are hoping that saying it out loud will make it not be true. I said, "Good morning, Dad." He said, "Claire." I said, "I think we should talk in person. Can you come to Chicago? I have an office there. I'll send you the address." There was a long pause. He said, "You have an office in Chicago." I said, "I do. Thursday works for me if it works for you." He said he would be there. I could tell he was already recalculating, already trying to fit this new information into the version of me he had built in his head. The one who did something vague with computers and lived in a city that wasn't Chicago and sat 3 seats down from the photographer because her mother asked her to. I sent him the address. Not a co-working space. Not a rented conference room. The building on Wacker Drive. The one his company leased its headquarters from. The one I owned. I was standing at the window of my conference room on the 9th floor when the car pulled up. I watched my father get out, and then my mother, which I hadn't expected, and then my brother, which I had. My brother was wearing a suit. He had his laptop bag. He looked like he was arriving for a negotiation, which I suppose he was, even if he didn't know yet what the terms were. I watched them walk to the entrance on the security feed from my laptop. The lobby attendant greeted them by name. Mr. and Mrs. Harmon, welcome. And you as well, sir. She offered them water. She offered them coffee. She called upstairs. She said, Miss Claire is ready for you. I heard later that my brother asked if I was the one who had hired her. The attendant said, Ms. Motter. Claire owns the building, sir. He said, I'm sorry. She repeated herself. He didn't say anything after that. They rode up in the elevator. I didn't go to meet them. I sat at the head of the conference table and let my assistant bring them in. My mother came through the door first. She looked around the room the way you look around a room when you're trying to figure out if you've been here before and can't reconcile your memory of it. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Lake Michigan in the distance. A table that cost more than my first apartment. She looked at me and she looked at the table and she looked at the view and she said, Claire. I said, Hi, Mom. Please sit down. My father walked in behind her. He had done the math faster than she had. I could see it in his face, the specific expression of a person whose internal accounting is no longer adding up. He sat down without being asked. My brother stood in the doorway for a moment. He looked at me the way he had looked at me my entire life, like I was a piece of furniture that had moved without explanation. He said, What is this? I said, Come in and close the door. He sat. I didn't perform it. I want to say that clearly because I've heard other people tell stories like this, and there's always a moment where they describe relishing it, the revenge, the payoff, and I understand that impulse, but that's not what I felt. What I felt was tired and clear. The kind of clear you feel after a very long drive when you finally see the sign for your exit. I opened the folder in front of me. I said, Harmon Industrial has been operating on borrowed time for about 6 years. You know this, Dad, you know this. The secondary credit line that went to fund the Westfield expansion cost the company $2.3 million in losses over 18 months. The refinancing in 2021 bought you 2 years but raised your monthly obligation by 30%. The lease on this building, had a clause that allowed the original lender to call the debt under specific conditions. Those conditions were met in February. My father said the lender sold that debt to an investment group. I said, yes. He said, You're telling me that investment group was you. I said, yes. My mother said, That's not possible. You work in IT. I looked at her for a moment. I said, Mom, I built a company that was acquired for $41 million. I have never worked in IT. I told you I did because every time I tried to tell you what I was actually doing, you changed the subject. She opened her mouth. She closed it. My brother said, So what do you want? Money? Is this about money? I looked at him. He was the one I had thought about the most in the months leading up to this moment. Not with hatred, I want to be clear about that too, but with something more complicated. He was a person who had been handed a role he didn't earn and had chosen to inhabit it completely rather than question it. In a different family, he might have been different. I didn't know. I only knew the version of him that existed in this one. I said, It's not about money. I have money. I slid a folder across the table to my father. He opened it slowly. The first page was a debt restructuring proposal. Not a foreclosure notice. Not an eviction. A proposal. I said, Here's what I'm offering. The holding company forgives 70% of the outstanding debt on the company's loan obligations. In exchange, the company restructures its leadership. The new operational model is outlined on page 3. My father looked up from the page. I said, Dad, Harmon Industrial is not going to survive the next 18 months under its current structure. The numbers don't work. I've had 3 analysts look at this independently. You know it too. This offer keeps the company alive. It keeps people employed. It keeps your name on the door, he said. And what do you get? I said, a board seat and an apology. Not now, not in this room, when you're ready. My mother made a sound I couldn't quite identify. Not crying. Something smaller than that. My brother said, an apology for what? I looked at him. I said, you know for what? He looked at the table. There was something else in the folder. I had debated including it for a long time. I had argued with my lawyer about it for 2 weeks. She had ultimately told me it was my decision and she would support whatever I chose. It was a record from my grandmother's estate. When my grandmother passed 8 years ago, she had set aside $60,000 specifically for my graduate education. It was in the estate documents. It was earmarked. It was mine. It never made it to me. My father had requested a discretionary disbursement from the estate trustee. The trustee had allowed it because my father was the executor and the language in the will allowed for family-directed educational expenses. He had submitted documentation that the funds were being used for education. They were used for my brother's Exeter tuition, the second year, the year I worked at the copy shop. I didn't say anything about it in the meeting. I just put the document in the folder. I let my father find it. He went very still when he got to that page. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at me. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, he looked at me the way he used to look at me on Saturday mornings when I was 8 years old and we were reading spreadsheets together. He said, Claire. I said, I know, Dad. He said, I don't know how to. I said, I know. We sat in that room for another hour. My brother asked questions, defensive ones at first, then quieter ones. My mother didn't say much. She held her coffee cup with both hands and looked at the lake. Before they left, my father signed the restructuring agreement. My lawyer had drawn it up in a form that was straightforward and legally clean. It didn't require him to acknowledge anything other than the business terms. The apology, if it ever came, would be separate. I walked them to the elevator. My aunt called me that night. Somehow she already knew or had pieced together enough of it to understand the shape of what had happened. She said, How do you feel? I said, honestly, like I can sleep now. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, she would have been proud of you, your grandmother. I want you to know that. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, I know. The restructuring took 8 months to finalize. Harmon Industrial is still operating. Some things changed and some things didn't, and I'm not going to tell you it became a perfect family story because it didn't. My brother and I have had 2 real conversations since that day, which is 2 more than I expected. My father called me on my birthday in March. He left a voicemail. It was a little awkward and a little stilted, and at the end he said, I'm proud of you, Claire. I should have said that a long time ago. I saved the voicemail. I've listened to it 4 times. My mother and I are still figuring it out. That's the honest answer. The thing I want to say. The thing I keep coming back to when people ask me why I didn't just walk away, why I bought the debt, why I stayed connected to people who had made me feel so small for so long, is this. I didn't do it because I wanted to destroy them. I did it because I needed to stop being the person who sat 3 seats down and said nothing. The board seat isn't the point. The apology wasn't the point. The point was that I stopped pretending I didn't exist. The point was that I walked into that building as myself. The whole version, not the edited one, not the one that works in IT and wears the right blazer and moves 3 seats down when asked. And I sat at the head of the table and I said, this is what I have built and this is who I am. That's all it ever was. When I was 22 and eating pasta with butter in my apartment in Austin, working until 2 in the morning, I used to think about what it would feel like to be seen by them. I thought I needed their version of success, their approval, their eyes on me the way they were always on my brother. I don't think that anymore. If you are building in the quiet, in the invisible years, in the years where no one in your family knows your name yet, keep going. Not for them, for the version of yourself that already knows you're worth seeing. She's going to need the foundation you're laying right now. She's going to sit at that table and not flinch. Keep building. People ask me sometimes if I feel guilty. Not about the business side of it, about doing it to my own family. And I always have to sit with that question for a second before I answer, because the honest answer is complicated, and I don't want to give them the clean version just because it's easier to hear. Here's what I actually believe, looking back at all of it now. What happened to my family wasn't some accident. It wasn't bad luck or a rough economy or circumstances nobody could control. It was a series of choices made by people who were capable of making different ones that created a world where one child was seen and one wasn't. My father chose to pull from my grandmother's estate. My mother chose to change the subject every time I tried to tell her what I was building. Those weren't passive failures. They were active decisions, and decisions have weight. They accumulate. They shape the world around them whether you intend them to or not. I think about the night I sat alone in my apartment in Austin, probably 23 years old, eating whatever was cheap and working on something nobody in my family knew existed. I wasn't angry then. I was just quiet. And in that quiet, I was learning something that I don't think you can learn any other way. That the people who are supposed to see you are not always the people who will. And that waiting for them to come around is a choice you make every single day you keep waiting. I stopped waiting. That was the first real decision I made that was entirely mine. The thing about building something in private, in the years when nobody is watching and nobody is impressed and nobody is asking how it's going, is that you have to locate your own standard. You have to decide for yourself what counts as enough and what doesn't, what's worth the next late night and what isn't. That process, that daily reckoning, is where character actually forms, not in the moments where people are watching, in the moments where they aren't. I'm not telling you my brother is a bad person. I don't know who he would have been in a family that asked more of him. What I know is that ease can be its own kind of damage. When everything is handed to you, the school, the car, the title, the floor of the building with your last name on the lease, you never have to find out what you're actually made of. And that is a loss, even if it doesn't look like one from the outside. What Dr. Voss said to me that summer at Northwestern, someone in your life has made you feel like you're not. I've thought about those words probably 1,000 times since. What she gave me in that one sentence was permission to disagree with the version of myself my family had authored. That's a kind of intelligence that has nothing to do with test scores or spreadsheets. It's the intelligence of understanding that the story you've been handed is not the only story available to you. The afternoon my father opened that folder and went still. I wasn't thinking about any of this. I was just sitting there, clear and tired, in the way you get after something is finally resolved. But I think about it now. I think about the fact that his hands shook a little when he turned to the page about my grandmother's money, and I think that somewhere in that moment, the full accounting of things became visible to him, not just the financial accounting. All of it. He left a voicemail on my birthday. He said he was proud of me. He said he was proud of me. He said he should have said it a long time ago. You can't manufacture that. You can't take a shortcut to the moment where someone finally sees you clearly. It comes from building something real enough that it cannot be ignored, from holding yourself to a standard that has nothing to do with their approval, and from having the patience to let the truth do its own work in its own time. That's all I did. I just kept building until the truth was too large to step around.